Hi everyone, welcome back. Thank you for coming to this class. This is the lead-based paint disclosure. And if you saw the previous video on the lead-based paint disclosure and why we have this and the pamphlet, then you'll be a little bit more prepared for this. But we're going to go over the lead-based paint disclosure in full. So in the first two paragraphs, it tells you why we have this disclosure, and it doesn't go into as much detail as the pamphlet does, but it does say that anything built 1978 and prior does have to have this disclosure because lead-based paint does cause neurological damage, damage to children, damage to pregnant women and unborn fetuses. A risk assessment or inspection for possible lead-based paint hazards is recommended prior to purchase. On line 13, it starts with the property address. Now, this is a disclosure that you, as a buyer's agent, is going to ask for or get off of the documents in MLS. If you notice that this home has been built before 1978 and the seller's agent hasn't put a lead-based paint disclosure up, you need to ask for one before making the offer because as you know, once an offer is accepted, it's kind of too late and the buyer can back out. So you want to make sure that you have all your paperwork together and ask for that lead-based paint disclosure. So because this should come from the seller and the buyer should then sign it like a COA, like the confirmation of agency. It should come from the seller. The buyer signs and gives it back to the seller's agent. So it should have the property address on it because everyone's going to be different. The seller may have different answers to these questions if it's for a different property. So on line 13, you have the property address. Make sure it matches the one that you're actually making an offer for. I have seen that not be right. On line 16, 15, 16, all the way through, you've got the seller questions. So seller disclosure. Seller to check one box below. A, presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards. They're going to click known lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards are present in the housing. Describe what is known. Or they're going to check seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint hazards are present in the house. So I've probably seen 1,500 contracts, and I don't think I've ever seen a seller that said, yes, we know of hazards, but that doesn't mean they're all being upfront and honest either. So let's say you have a house that was painted, that was built in 1955, 1960, whatever, and it had a basement. And the basement was painted when the house was built, but it hasn't been painted again. That's something that you would want to say, and put down there. You'd want to check that box and say, this home was built in 1965. Original paint is still in the basement and has not been corrected and remedied and painted over. So that would be like an idea of what you would put there. Or you would check on box 19. Seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint and or paint hazards in the housing if you're the seller's agent. Next, we have two more boxes that the seller has to choose from. Records and reports available to seller. Either seller has provided the purchaser with all available records and reports pertaining to lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards in the house. List the documents below. You're asking what kind of documents would they be? Well, let's say you have a house that was built in 1965 and the seller did have it scraped and painted and they wanted to provide you proof that a painter had been in there and had done that work and they'd recently been painted. That's something that you would write in that line, like describe what is, these are the documents that we're giving to the seller. Or on line 25, seller has no reports or records pertaining to lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards in the housing. This is what 99%, Again, never seen a seller that said, hey, yeah, we've got lots of lead-based paint. We've been living in it. Here's all of our proof that the house is hazardous. So normally you're going to see line 19 and line 25 have been checked. Check with your broker and get their opinion on if you think that there's old paint that hasn't been painted over, what they would want you to disclose. Let that be up to your broker to tell you what they prefer, because you can always ask the seller. Then on line 26, it starts with the buyer acknowledgement. 27, buyer has received copies of all records and reports pertaining to lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards. Or line 30, has not received any records and reports regarding lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards. So if the seller has documents and things that they want to give you and information about the hazards in the house, then you would say, yes, we have received that. But if the seller has checked, we have nothing and know of nothing in the house, then you're going to check line 30, which is, we have not received any records and reports regarding lead-based paint. On 32, your buyer, this is the first place that your buyer is going to initial, not the seller. Line 32, initial. Buyer has received the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. This should accompany this disclosure. Line 34, contingency. Buyer to check one box, either line 35 or line 38. Line 35 says, agreement is subject to buyer's approval of the results of a risk assessment or inspection of the property for the presence of lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards to be completed at the buyer's expense. This contingency shall be satisfied within 10 calendar days after the binding agreement date. Or they're going to check line 38. Buyer waives the opportunity to conduct a risk assessment or inspection of the presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards. You're going to know whether it's old paint that's from the 1970s or newer paint. I think it's probably pretty easy to say this is probably old paint. It's probably got lead in it. You probably want to paint over it or have it tested. I don't really know the price of having it tested because I've never really had anybody have it tested, but I'm sure any inspector, if you get an inspector in there, he's going to tell you whether there's old paint that needs to be scraped and painted. So most of the time, it is buyer waives the opportunity to conduct a risk assessment. This is something that you're going to want to talk to your buyer about to make the right determination on either lines 35 or line 38. But they do have to check one of those boxes. On line 41 and 43, they had these check boxes here, but now they've got a line through them this year because most of the seller and buyer agent didn't know that they were supposed to actually initial or write NA. And I'll go through why you would write NA. On line 41, seller's agent has informed the seller of the seller's obligations under 42 U.S.C. 4852D and is aware of his or her responsibility to ensure compliance. So this isn't the seller that's initialing. This is the listing agent. The listing seller's agent has to put their initials there. And sometimes you're going to get a lead-based paint that's uploaded into MLS and the seller's agent will have forgotten to initial that. So you just need to make sure before you give it to compliance that that agent initials it. On line 43, buyer's agent has informed seller of the seller's obligations under 42 U.S.C. 4852D and is aware of his or her responsibility to ensure compliance. This is only required if buyer's agent receives compensation from the seller. This is why you would write NA. if you have a buyer's agent agreement where you, as the buyer's agent, are getting paid from the buyer, you would just write NA. You don't have to tell the seller anything. You don't have to initial that as the buyer's agent. Let's say this is a unrepresented buyer, then you would still need to initial as the buyer's agent because you're most likely going to be receiving compensation from the seller. It's just a acknowledgement. I would say either way, I would initial it as a buyer's agent anyway, even if your buyer is giving you all of the compensation. There's no downside to initialing it as long as everybody has all the disclosures and pamphlet that they need, and every, all of this documentation has the right signatures and initials. Line 46 through 50, it's saying, if I'm signing this, I certify that everything to the best of my knowledge is provided is true. So if the sellers are saying we have no knowledge of lead-based paint, and then the buyer buys it, this kind of protects the buyer's agent and the buyer that, hey, we walked in and there's only lead-based paint in here. You had to have known this. That could save a party from a lot of financial liability in having to repaint or something, and can get out of the contract if they find out that there's a lot of lead-based paint that can't be quickly remedied. On lines 51 through 70, it's for everybody to sign. So obviously the seller has to sign it. If there's two sellers, you need to make sure that both sellers have signed it. Lines 57, the buyer signs. If there's two buyers, there's four buyers, everybody has to sign it. That's on the contract. Then you have the real estate licensees. So you, as the buyer or seller, listing agent, you're all signing this. Everybody has to have their signatures on it. Then at the bottom, it says for informational purposes only, just like the purchase and sale, because if you need to go back and write the firm and you need to write the licensee's number, then it's acceptable because it's not changing this document. That's the reason for this, for information purposes only. So if you need to add that later, just like in the purchase and sale, if you need to add the phone number of the agent later, it's not considered changing the contract. So you would make sure that all of the information here is correct. So to wrap up, you have both licensees. If there's two listing agents, they both need to sign it. If there's four sellers, they all need to sign it. If there's two buyers, they all need to sign it. The buyer's agent has signed, the seller's or has initialed, the seller's agent has initialed. You've got check marks where they belong. Check all of those to make sure, because if there's not a check mark, when you get it as a buyer's agent, you're going to have to send it back to the listing agent, ask them to check it, and then everybody has to initial it because there has been a change in one of the contract documents. So that's the disclosure. Now on the pamphlet's right here. I would have both parties, specifically your party. If you're the seller, I would have them initial. If you're the buyer's agent, I would have them initial this pamphlet to make sure that they understand that they got this pamphlet. They can't come back and say that they never received it. Even if they initialed the buyer's place that said right here, buyer has received the pamphlet. Even if they initialed this, I would still make them, ask them to initial right here on this first page that they did receive this pamphlet, just to protect yourself. That's all.